Yep. Before I start my speech, just want to do a short trigger warning. The speech would contain some substances and words of violence and sexual assault. Not necessarily meant to offend anyone, just for the sole purpose of this debate and for the speech only. Right. Then starting in three, two, one. Two framings before moving on to extension. One, opening debate has this huge deadlock because they cannot even agree on a mechanism of what impoverishment even means. All push the burden away have to defend, taking everything away from the corruptors to the point that they are fucking poor. OG mechanized by mentioning a 150%, but necessarily justifying A, why specifically that number, or B, why is that proportional. In CG, we will go to our very worst case and we argue, why even if they're totally impoverished and they declare bankruptcy and they have no job, it's still justified. Thus, we win by default in every single definition if we can prove the justification. But secondly, just engaging a bit on some more weird concerns about opening opposition, right? They told you that government will have to take care of ex-corruption unjustified. This is weird because in opposition, they literally let them walk around with their stolen money and build a castle that they represent like Cipriano Fanto. But secondly, they also argue that they will hide corruption even more. People will hide corruption anyway in both sides because they don't want to get punished, so there's no delta in that argument. Two extensions including government will win this debate. One, weighing of rights as a principle of criminal justice system, and secondly, I'm going to break the depth of rehabilitation and opening telling you what actually is the benefit of this debate, right? First, let's talk about weighing of rights. This is a very important principle of real of explanation. One, I will tell you how this argument will weigh in the debate. Why this extension will win? Two reasons. A, this will negate all harm of rights of families of corruptors whatsoever, because I'm going to tell you that those rights are not as equally important as the rights of vulnerable individuals. But B, this will also outweigh OG principle of proportionality, because even though yes, it's a part of its justice system, OG has never even attempted to argue what is important or is the most important one. Precedences do exist, for example. We're talking about trigger warning. Sexual assaulters are mostly punishable by death in the Western world with increasing democracy and social awareness. While the impact might not be proportional to the punishment of death, it is the weighing of victims and society's rights to social protection that becomes the basis of the verdict. We argue that the weighing of rights of who's to be prioritized and who's to be justified to deprioritize is the fundamental of every justice system, proving it to be much more important than proportionality. Secondly, right, what rights are exactly being weighed here? The weighing here is between the rights of taxpayer and poor people to receive their state promised benefit and the rights of the protection to the corruptors who takes away that money for the benefit. Three important considerations. A, they have different degree of social standing and political power. This means that corruptors are mostly people with high political power in the country that Eugene even bothered to argue. We're talking about high-ranking government officials, people sitting in the parliament or senate or whatever, right? My point here is that even without the presence of the corruption to begin with, the state as a democratically elected body should look after the most vulnerable individual, be on the lower social standing. We're talking about middle lower class, people living under poverty, people deprived of access to basic fundamental needs in rural areas, right? It's only intuitive to argue that the rights of these individuals way more because they are more reliant on the state as well, understanding that there's a different degree of social standing. B, a direct harm is implemented against the vulnerable people on the lower social standing, right? This is like when Giuliani Batubara stole the money for social welfare. It came at the expense of thousands of people not being able to access tobacco or even basic education. So not only that there's already a glaring social difference that the state has to look after, now the upper class or the corruptors deliberately conspire using corruption to deprive the lower class of their daily necessities. So sure, we argue that the rights of the vulnerable people, on the virtue of them being a victim, but also a failure of the state to cater to, need to be prioritized compared to the perpetrator corruptor who consentedly, knowingly, and intentionally stole their life state while being aware that it might as well kill them all. But lastly, comparative of worst case, right? Sure, we take the bullet and argue that children of the corruptors won't get education. We don't care. We posit that A, this is fine, because for so long they have already reaped unjust benefit that their parents stole from vulnerable actor, they're still quite complicit in a way. But secondly, at worst they cannot continue their doctorate in Harvard, while on the comparative in opposition, literally people in rural areas cannot even access elementary or middle school because of corruption. So no, even in the comparative worst case, CG is still better. Lastly, you're right. Why is this important? I told you that this is the fundamental of every justice system. Understand that on every verdict made by judges in the criminal justice system, there are considerations of one of its super important principle of state responsibility, which considers that in every occurrence of crime, the state has failed to cater to the needs or the protection of either the victim or perpetrator, and therefore the state owes either one of them more protection by punishing the other. That is to say, in this specific case, we argue that the state has failed the victims more talking about poor people or from taxpayers in general, right? Because the state could not provide accountability or monetary transparency whatsoever, and the state did not perform optimally in safeguarding the tax money. This is a very important principle because it smoothly ties into our analysis of why even at the worst case scenario of the corruptors become terribly poor, this is not only justified, but it's also even a responsibility for the state to do so to compensate for their failure. This extension is not derivative because we told you a more important consideration compared to mere proportionality with opening government argued without even explaining what is important. Second extension, let's bring deadlock in the rehabilitation of opening debate, right? I think OGs kind of argue that deprivation of money will change them, and all argue that, oh no, they will be petty criminals, jails are better. Three lines of analysis of this argument as well, right? One, let's talk about the three reasons why this rehabilitation debate opening is relevant. A, no teams can actually prove to you why people do corruption to begin with. And without such information, you can necessarily determine the root cause of corruption, thus no solution would be perfect in either world. B, even if there's such analysis, understand that people would deal with punishments differently. This way, for some people with different trait or characteristic, for example, jail might not be enough or even might be too harsh. This showcases that the inherently rehabilitation debate opening is pretty subjective and case specific, right? At best, it is insignificant, at worst, it is relevant. But lastly, we posit that people do corruption out of greed. Therefore, the mindset of corruptors are excited to get more and more money. OG argued that it's the reason why they have worked, but they never explain why. In CG, we posit that greed and lust for monetary wealth is an uncurable moral deprivation that is not likely to be solved in both sides anyway with a single policy because of the super high threshold of changing them, right? This makes it a perfect target for criminal justice system because that's the initial purpose, to cater to the morally deprived individuals in society. Second layer, we posit an exclusive benefit on CG of injection of state capital from the personal treasures of these rich corruptors. This is important because even taking our worst case on framing that corruptors will never be cured, then we would gladly take more and more money back if there is more corruption. And this time it is added with the personal money of these rich corruptors who might be generationally wealthy anyway, right? This means better circulation of state money and better allocation. This is a better benefit than OG because it doesn't rely on the fickle basis that people can recover from the corrupt habit. We don't care, but we still prove why social welfare will exist and even better allocated anyway in CG. Lastly, why is this extension winning, right? Three reasons. A, this mechanizes smoothly how the money will be allocated, at least not just a certain OG. B, this does with the most certain benefit. We don't rely on subjectivity or how much people love their families and will argue or how harsh we find prison can be. Benefit is certain. Lastly, this is with the urgency that book openings are conveniently left out. Understanding that countries with corruption are mostly third world countries like the global south, this is a much needed capital injection for infrastructure and social welfare, for example, because otherwise they cannot do that. At least this time in closing government, we can utilize the corruptors to do something good with their money to provide welfare, not only to become the societal toxic poison that will be perpetuated over and over again in the culture built by opposition. We're never prouder to propose.
Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think CC is automatically winning in this debate. Firstly, they never really explain in opening why most likely you can actually get all these things about deterrence, why most likely it's going to be proportional, like opening opposition is going to say that regard to jail. None of this has been explained. What has been opening in opening bands was actually both teams trying to tell out their assertions without actually trying to give you any structural analysis as to what is likely and as to what is encompassing, for example, its element, right? I think CC, when we actually already brought to you why most likely we can actually deal with the problems of rehabilitation and why that's not important, and why even if it's proportional, we can still go through with the policy anyway, why that's principally justifiable, for example, it's in the right. By virtue of bringing that alone, we already break the deadlock in opening winning this debate list element, right? But even then, I'm going to talk about two main layers, right? Firstly, I'm going to talk about the independent battles on some points that opening opposition tried to bring. Secondly, I'm going to tell you the three issues in this debate, the main issues, and why we win over OG, while also responding to some of the things brought by opening opposition, right? Firstly, let's talk about the independent rebuttals. OO brought two things that was never responded by OG, right? Firstly, in regards to corruption is justifiable. Secondly, in regard to proportionality, right? So, in regard to corruption is justifiable, right? Opening opposition tried to bring to you an argument about how most likely people in poor countries, for example, need this extra money because they cannot make ends meet, for example, in the money. We do not believe that this is the case. Why? Because most likely you're not going to be talking about the beggars on the street when we're talking about this bill, because most likely those people do not have access to state funds, meaning they cannot even do corruption to begin with. But secondly, even if the country is that poor, ladies and gentlemen, in law, it is still not justifiable to do things that is opposing to the law, even if you're suffering, right? If you can do that, then they basically want to justify things like robbing people. They want to justify things like stealing from your neighbor, for example, ladies and gentlemen, right? Obviously, the law doesn't permit that, so that also falls down. Secondly, in regard to proportionality, they talk to you about how jail is going to be proportional in comparison to like impoverishment, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, no analysis. Secondly, no comparison to the harm that it brought to you. And thirdly, we also believe that this is somewhat proportional, right? Why? Because most likely that the harm that you do as a corruptor is not stopped at the extent about the amount of money that you stole from state funds. It also extends to the opportunity cost and the further harm and the prolonged harm that you actually impose to people living on the ground. That is to say that just because you stole money and you cannot build a hospital, the harm doesn't stop there. Because there is no hospital, for example, people cannot get medication for their children. Because there is no elementary school, people cannot give education to their children, for example, right? Meaning that there is a prolonged harm being suffered by the society that justifies taking away more of their money than what they actually took from state funds, right? So with those two independent rebuttals, let's move on to the main issues in the debate, right? So 3 issues here. First is security, second, deterrence, and rehabilitation, and thirdly, we're going to talk about state funds and how we maximize it, right? First, let's talk about security and proportionality for the family, ladies and gentlemen, right? Opening opposition tried to tell you about this argumentation about how you cannot punish the family. They are literally innocent, ladies and gentlemen. Number one, notice that things like services like Sembako also exist, so they're not going to necessarily be homeless, and they're not going to be necessarily, starving, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, you're also backstabbing your own principle, right? Because under your side, you also want things like jail. You also want these people to return the money that they took from state funds. I mean that their family is also going to suffer under their side of the house. So many asymmetrical in regard to the harm over the family. What both things in the opening did not prove, though, was justified to actually make them suffer, ladies and gentlemen, or at the very least make them an incidental victim of actually making these corruptors impoverished, right? Number one, ladies and gentlemen, Justin already told you why most it is going to be important, because in comparison to the weighing of rights between these two, it's better for us to punish the families, or at the very least make the families suffer in that regard, right? Why? Because number one, notice that the amount of urgency here is obviously weighed more towards the vulnerable people, because in comparison, ladies and gentlemen, unlike the politician's sons or their family, for example, that have enjoyed the luxuries of corruption, enjoyed the luxuries of having their father or like husband having a high political standing in the government, for example, most likely the people on the ground which has nothing at all is in severely much less better off conditions, which meaning that they literally do not have any welfare, for example, ladies and gentlemen. So in terms of urgency, we should focus on the people more. Obviously, it's also the obligation of the government to do that. Secondly, in terms of necessity, ladies and gentlemen, I do not believe the harm of you literally not having any water, not having any education, not having any hospitals, for example, is comparable to the menial benefit of you buying a new Ferrari, ladies and gentlemen, or sending your kid to Harvard, for example, right? So in terms of necessity, the vulnerable people obviously also weighs more. Secondly, though, ladies and gentlemen, there has never been a justification that you are allowed to be happy at the expense of others people suffering, right? This is a principal fallacy under opening opposition, because they literally told you that it's okay for you to keep on going and using this corruption money, and you should not take this particular money, for example, because your family is still going to suffer. But the happiness that they perceive right now and the happiness that they're feeling is a constant product of other people suffering, which is obviously principally unjustifiable, right? Now, moving on to the second point then about rehabilitation. The reason why both teams in opening cannot win in this regard is simply because none of the teams actually explain why rehabilitation can work. Opening opposition never explained a single amount of reasoning as to why jail is effective. Meanwhile, opening government, even though they try to explain about how your life will suddenly change in the village, for example, and they never really give you a structured explanation as to why that's luckily for every single corruptors. They took a high burden, but they unfortunately failed to meet their expectation. Why do we win over them in this regard then? Because Justin told you an important point, but how most likely you cannot achieve that burden. Because simply people are so blinded by greed, meaning that they are already irrational to begin with. Or different people acknowledges punishment differently. Some people will be deterred, some people will not be deterred. But the main certain point here is the fact that even if rehabilitation does not work, you're still going to have a massive injection of state funds. We told you it's okay if people keep corrupting, because at the very least the city is going to have much more funds, for example, by the virtue of you're going to take everything away from these politicians that actually do corruption, ladies and gentlemen. This is good. Why? Because the urgency here is that poor developing countries sometimes do not have enough funds to develop their entire country, right? You usually pick and choose which sectors that you want to improve while leaving the other sectors to die. Under Outside the House, when you take away more than what they actually corrupted in regard to state funds, you're going to have more money to develop the country, for example, ladies and gentlemen. So you do not have to necessarily, sacrifice a sector to develop another one, which is a main benefit that has never been explained under opening balance, right? But secondly, in regard to, catering to people that are left behind by the government because they are impoverished, for example, the corruptors, right? We believe, again, by actually acquiring this massive amount of state funds, you can also cater to them under Outside the House, because you can use the millions and millions of dollars that they corrupted to actually also support them. By the way, they're also minority, so they're not necessarily that big of a burden to begin with. So because we explained to you the principle is debate and why most likely it's okay if you're improportional, and we also explained to you breaking every single data in regard to security, rehabilitation, and state funds, we automatically win this debate over all other teams. And because of that, we are very proud to propose. Thank you very much.